All right. Well, it is 7:30 according to my phone at least. Thank you all so much for joining us. We're really excited to have you here. This is the second session of Just Zero's Waste-Free Future Summit. I hope some of you were able to catch our keynote this afternoon. I don't know about you, but I thought it was incredibly impactful. We had Diane Wilson telling the story about her decades-long fight with Formosa Plastics, which, no spoilers for everyone, but does have a happy ending. In case you did miss it, it was recorded and we will be making it available. But tonight, our session is focusing on zero waste legislation, and we're so excited to have you with us. For those of you who are unfamiliar, my name is Peter Blair. I am the Policy and Advocacy Director with Just Zero, and I am joined by Kevin.
Everyone, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you, Peter, for kicking us off. My name is Kevin Budris. I'm the Deputy Director at Just Zero. And before we get going here, I just wanted to make a few housekeeping notes before Peter kicks us off in full. A quick reminder, this event is being recorded. So both heads up on that and the fact that we will be making this recording available to all of our email subscribers after the fact. So if you are interested in catching up with the recording, the best possible way to ensure that you get it is to make sure that you sign up for our email list if you are not already on Just Zero's email list. I also want to let you all know that we're going to be reserving some time at the end of our presentation, at the end of our discussion tonight, to answer questions that many of you may have. The best way for you to get a question to us, for us to answer, is to use the Q&A feature on Zoom. So submit any questions that you have through Q&A as they come up throughout the course of the event tonight. Please feel free to just pop them in the Q&A, send them our way, and we will loop back to as many of them as we can at the end of the presentation tonight when we go through the Q&A. And with that, Peter, I think I'll hand it back to you to get us going now.
All right, thanks so much, Kevin. Yeah, we've got a lot to get through, and we want to get to your questions. So let's dive into it. And so tonight's topic is zero waste legislation. This is something Just Zero spends a pretty significant amount of our time on passing new laws at the state and local level, and that's because it is incredibly important. And before we dive into how we do this work and the wonderful toolkits we've created that we hope have made it easier for folks to pass laws and ordinances in their communities, we do have to kind of take a minute to step back and focus on why new laws are so important. And the fact is, we have a very broken system in this country. We produce 300 million tons of waste per year in the US. It is just a staggering amount of waste. And ultimately, most of this is being burned in an incinerator or buried in a landfill. Neither of these are sustainable solutions. They are climate damaging, they are poisonous, they both leave toxic legacies, and they're incredibly risky and expensive. These really are not the ways we should be dealing with this type of waste, but it's unfortunately the status quo.
And Peter, I'd love to chime in there, especially on the point of the status quo and how much waste we're producing. To just add that, this false choice between burning and burying and these 300 million tons that we're producing of waste each year are really the result of a truly pervasive fallacy when it comes to our waste. So many of the folks in power, especially many of our politicians, of course, the folks that run the plastics industry and run the waste industry, want us to think that waste is inevitable, that this is just a reality of our life, and we're just boxed into figuring out what to do with it after the fact. And that's just so incorrect. It's just so wrong. And a lot of what we're talking about tonight when it comes to legislative solutions are really geared toward reorienting ourselves away from that fallacy or away from that false reality that waste is always going to be in our lives.
Exactly, Kevin. It really is. And what's so frustrating is that when we talk about this inevitability, when we talk about the fact that, we're throwing so much away, away is a real place. Away is people's homes, it's their communities, it's where their kids go to school, it's the parks. these facilities are embedded in our society and they're so dangerous and they have just this legacy of pollution. And unfortunately, it's not a surprise that most of these facilities are in environmental justice communities. And moving away from the status quo is completely right. It's what we need to do. And the good news is we can change the status quo. There are real zero waste systems, real zero waste solutions that we can enact, that we can use to shift how we think about and talk about waste. A lot of these have already been implemented in some states in the US, definitely across countries and other jurisdictions. Bottle bills, making sure we're really capturing beverage containers and recycling them. Pay-as-you-throw programs to really focus on putting a price tag on the amount of waste we're producing and encourage people to divert their waste. Composting, taking food waste and turning it into good fertilizer. We have these systems. The problem is the laws on the books do not actually encourage them. Really, the laws we have are waste management laws, which are focused on funneling it towards those burning and burying systems.
Peter, and I love that you describe these as real, because they're real in the sense that not only can they solve the problem, but they're real in the sense that they're tangible. They're right here within our reach. They're solutions that, as you said, states, cities, counties across the country have already implemented many of these things in varying combinations. And we can see from real evidence in the real world, in this country and in countries across the world, that rolling up our sleeves and implementing these types of programs, these types of solutions, are the way that we reverse that status quo, that we get out of the trap, out of the fallacy, out of the false choice between burning and burying our waste. There's no magic bullet here, right? There's nothing on this slide that you have up here, Peter, that's like, okay, everybody just do this one thing and the problem's solved and it goes away. And usually when you hear folks pitching, they're like, okay, we just have to do this one thing. It means they're selling a story. They're not these real tangible solutions that we're here to talk about tonight.
Exactly. And you're so right that these are within our reach. And one of the things we really try to do at Just Zero is make sure that people feel that these solutions are within their reach. And that's where we shift into the focus of our new legislative toolkits. These are new tools that Just Zero recently launched that are designed to make sure that folks can reach these systems, that they can implement these changes in their community. They're designed to really empower folks to figure out what they need to do, and we provide the language that gets them there.
Yeah, Peter, and I'm glad that you kind of grounded us here in this conversation about the toolkits around the concept of empowering folks, empowering communities, empowering advocates, teams of advocates, empowering coalitions, in a lot of ways also empowering lawmakers like state legislators, county officials, folks who work at environmental agencies, and city councilors and other folks who are on the ground implementing these laws or striving to implement these laws and policies across the country. Because we did create these toolkits to empower communities and advocates to implement many of the solutions that Peter just highlighted on the earlier slide. And importantly, implement those solutions by choosing which solutions they want to prioritize, which solutions they think they can get implemented based on the political realities that they know best, that they're facing in their own communities. And importantly, what they'd like those solutions to look like by building the legislative solutions, the policy solutions themselves from the ground up, rather than being handed some, here's your piece of legislation, go out and try to do it. Empowering folks to do this the way they want to do it, focusing on their priorities, starting from the ground up. We've designed this approach in these toolkits in keeping with Just Zero's holistic approach to all of our work. So here at Just Zero, especially for those folks attending tonight or watching the recording who aren't quite as familiar with what we do here at Just Zero, we do employ a holistic approach to all of our work. And that work includes not only pushing back against the false solutions, against the burning and burying of trash, pushing back against attempts to build new landfills or incinerators, or expand current landfills, or extend the life of aging, highly polluting, climate damaging incinerators. But we are also obviously working on the other side to help folks across the country implement just, equitable policies that stop waste before it starts, so that we don't have to kind of continue this fight decade after decade after decade to try to stop and close down dangerous polluting facilities. And especially when it comes to working on those policy solutions, our holistic approach really embraces three main pillars: education, policy, and community engagement. So we start with the education pillar and using conversations, written resources, educational events, and other opportunities to spread the word about zero waste policy initiatives, to provide sound examples, clue folks in to what's going on in places all around the country and sometimes all across the globe. When it comes to policy, we work through model legislation, and especially our new model legislative toolkits, to work aside lawmakers and advocates to kind of help community members, help advocates implement nation-leading zero waste policy proposals. And when it comes to community engagement, whether it's through events like this, whether it's through features in our model legislative toolkits, we aim to engage with groups, grassroots organizations, coalitions, to work alongside them as they, again, are pursuing their own zero waste goals. So much of that is tied in to how we've set up these toolkits. And what we've done here at Just Zero, just in the last few weeks, is start by launching 6 brand new model legislative toolkits on our website. Thanks, Peter, for advancing this slide. And I see that, that we've got in the chat now a link to the model legislative toolkits. I'd encourage folks, whether you want to look at these as we're going through this presentation tonight, or whether you want to save the link and access them later. We've also got a QR code up on this slide. So if you want the full multi-screen experience where you've got the toolkits on your mobile device and you're also listening to Peter and I talk and watching our PowerPoint slides, go for it. We want this experience, just like the toolkits themselves, to be as interactive as possible. These toolkits, after all, are interactive and customizable. And we've grounded all of this in the question that you see at the top of this slide here. What issue do you want to address in your community? That's where we're starting with these. And so these 6 different toolkits provide 6 different pathways, 6 different options for folks to learn about, to explore, to build policy priorities using their own goals, their own missions, the bits and pieces that they think they can get done in their community. So to quickly run through them, these 6 issues that folks can address through the toolkits are: number 1, beverage containers. I'm going to kind of proceed through these in the order they're on the website and in these slides. The beverage container toolkit effectively allows folks to build a bottle bill program, a draft piece of legislation to implement a bottle bill program in their state, or even in some instances in their city. Bottle bills, also known as deposit return systems, are the single most effective collection and recycling system for beverage containers that this country and the world have frankly ever seen. And they also provide an important platform for reusable beverage containers, again, in this country and throughout the world. Issue number 2 that folks can address using the model legislative toolkits is food waste. We'll hear a little bit more in detail from Peter on this legislative toolkit later tonight, but this toolkit effectively allows folks to build from the ground up a food waste prevention and recycling law that fits, again, the needs of their community, the realities of their state, and what they would like to accomplish through food waste diversion. There's a greenwashing toolkit that allows folks to build what is often called a truth in labeling piece of legislation, which effectively forces companies to stop lying about whether their products are recyclable or compostable. They can address packaging waste by building a packaging reduction and recycling law. They can address single-use plastics, and we'll talk a little bit more about this toolkit later tonight. by selecting from a menu of options of different single-use plastics that they can ban or restrict in their community. And our sixth toolkit concerns high heat facilities, which allows folks to kind of design different options. It's another kind of mix and match approach to try to push back against existing or proposed incinerators, chemical recycling facilities, anything else that tries to burn trash or plastics in their community.
Yeah, and thank you for that overview, Kevin. I think it's important. People are probably wondering, well, why did you start with these six, right? Well, don't worry, we are going to build more, but these six are things we are really seeing a lot of interest in at the state and local level. A lot of these can be implemented at local ordinances, but really these are a lot of the laws we're seeing gain a lot of traction because they really do address some of the root problems with the existing system. So that was the kind of thinking behind it. I'll kick it back over to Kevin to talk about the wonderful features we have that makes it interactive and customizable.
Yeah, and I'm glad that you mentioned that these are the six areas that we see interest in across the country, because that's what we're really focusing on. Again, what do advocates across the country want to focus on and work on? That is the biggest goal of these toolkits, is to prioritize goals of individual communities of state-based advocates throughout the country. Peter, if you can hop to the next slide, I'm going to keep us moving here a little bit. And by prioritizing what folks in their communities want to focus on, what goals they have, what pieces of legislation they want to prioritize, the point is to center local perspectives, leadership, and expertise, and to prioritize adaptability over a one-size-fits-all approach. We design these as toolkits, again, that are customizable, that are adaptable, not just because it fits with our mission and it's the right thing to do to empower communities, it's also the most effective. Folks in their communities working toward environmental protections in communities in their states and in their cities know best what policies they want to get passed, and they know best what they should look like. So we've designed the educational examples, the sample language options that we'll go through a little bit later tonight in these toolkits all around that goal. We want to empower communities and local advocates who know best what they can get done, what they want to get done, and what should be accomplished in their individual communities. We can contrast that with an approach that many organizations have taken in the past to kind of static model legislation that like, this is the best possible single-use plastic ban you can design, or this is the best possible bottle bill for your state or any state. So take this and try to get it done in your community. That doesn't really work. That ignores on the ground political realities. It limits those opportunities to experiment and try new approaches, which have been crucial to developing all of these initiatives and creating, frankly, the examples that we highlight in a lot of these communities. Communities on the ground have been out there trying to tweak and get past the best possible single-use plastic bans all across the country. So let's learn from their examples, good, bad, and otherwise, and allow folks to continue down that path of adapting, of trying new things out. And we think these toolkits, using just that example, enable them to do exactly that. Static model legislation, it can limit momentum. It dismisses that local expertise and those viewpoints that I mentioned earlier. This is all about centering in what you all attending here tonight, maybe watching this webinar in the future, watching the recording in the future, or playing with the toolkits on your own time or with a coalition, decide you think is going to work best. Go with that. Just Zero is here to help. That's why we created these toolkits. That's why we're here speaking with you tonight. And that's why we want to be a part of this ongoing dialogue as folks try to use these types of resources to build policy proposals on the ground in their own states.
That's exactly right, Kevin. And thank you so much for explaining the kind of thinking behind the toolkits. And I'm really proud of what we've tried to do. But a lot of people are probably wondering, especially if you think like me, well, how does this actually work? So I'm going to briefly walk through kind of how this really is a choose your own adventure system for creating a policy that empowers your community and that addresses the concerns that you have. So it's really a three-step process that we've created, which is we've said this a lot, but start with your priorities. Figure out what is the pressing issue that you're concerned about in your community. Are you worried about the single-use plastics you're seeing littering your beaches, your streets, your parks? Are you really fed up with the amount of food waste that is being generated and sent to your landfill? Are you tired of having to stand over your recycling bin and look at all these false and misleading labels? Are you really concerned about the trash burning facilities that's being proposed? You know, all of these are the options. These are real problems that people are facing every day, and we want to empower you to figure out what is the thing you want to work at. Once you figure that out, we have a corresponding toolkit, and it explains both the issue that you want to address, but also the legislative solution. And it breaks down what the policy can do. It has examples from states and communities where they have already enacted this type of policy, and in some cases, the results they've seen. And then really what makes this a choose your own adventure system is that as you go through the bill and look at these different things and you explore the different policies, you're going to see options. You're going to see the ways that one community has done it and another community has done it differently. And you're going to go through and figure out what is the best fit for your state, for your city, for your town. So we always start all of our toolkits with language that sets the stage, that really breaks down the issue in understandable terms and presents the solution. Because we do know that while we're talking about this now, these things are complicated and it can be hard to figure out what is the exact legislative solution for the problem that you're worried about. So we always make sure that every toolkit sets the stage. And once you have that setting, once you understand it, it's the part that we think is really fun and the part I hope you think is fun. And that's building your bill. So we have bill templates in every single toolkit, which is essentially a document that is the bare bones of your bill. It has each section, but there's no language in it. These are going to help you construct a policy, a bill, a proposal for your community. And as you go through the toolkits, you're going to see that each toolkit is separated out into distinct sections and distinct bill sections, the way a bill is typically written. And each section has the different options you can take, the different decisions you can make, the different approaches that are available to you, as well as those examples. So you can sit there and think, it's great that they did this in New York, but that's really not going to work for my state. Is there a more restrictive, better approach that'll fit the concerns that I'm really worried about and the political realities I'm facing? And then each section, once you make that decision and find out what you think works for you, we provided the sample bill language that you copy and paste into the template and move on, and you do this section by section until you've essentially created a customized, tailored bill that works for you.
Peter, especially in building that customized, tailored bill, and you mentioned examples from different states and cities and things like that. I mean, that's a really key part of this, right? Like, we want folks to be empowered to build the bill that they want, that's going to work for them. But we're also not trying to leave folks hanging with, like, okay, here's 5 different options that you can choose from. Like, go with what you feel. Again, tying in our holistic approach and our pillars of education, policy, and community engagement, we're trying through these toolkits to provide guidance that will help folks make the right decisions. Because some of you all watching this or attending tonight may go into building a bottle bill, and you've worked with bottle bills before, you've run a campaign, you're familiar with all this stuff. You're just ready to put the pieces together. But we also want these to be useful for folks who are like, I've never thought about a bottle bill in my state before. So, like, where do I start and how do I weigh the different options? It is our goal, it is our hope that these toolkits are useful in actually going through that exercise and providing some of the guidance that some folks might need to weigh the different options, weigh the different pieces, learn from some of the best practices, and sometimes some of the pitfalls from around the country.
Yeah, that's exactly right, Kevin. And it really is. We've taken the approach we take to all of our zero waste advocacy and really tried to embed it in these toolkits. And I know we're talking about the legislative process and passing these bills, and we by no means think that it is easy. And once you have developed your bill, you're going to be able to introduce it and have a law. We know it's not that simple. We know the legislative process is in some ways purposely designed to be confusing, to be hard to access. And we're aware of that. So we also have included a legislative process overview as part of the toolkits that really breaks down how the legislative process typically works. We know every state, every community has their own nuances, but this is typically the system they all follow. But more importantly, throughout this, it doesn't just walk you through what the legislative process looks like, but it has tips for building coalitions, for working with decision makers, for finding the key points in the process that are going to allow you to give your bill momentum, to make your voices heard, and to really help the chances of your bill becoming a law. This includes things like how to participate in the public hearing process, how to develop a successful op-ed or letter to the editor that raises the profile of this issue so that it's something, the larger community is concerned about and aware of. So we know it's hard. We also know that the toolkits won't solve everything, so we do encourage you to contact us. We're always here and happy to help.
And,
But
and Peter, I know you alluded to this, but it's hard by design, right? Like it stinks, but the reality is so many of the systems around building and passing legislation or building and passing ordinances are opaque and inscrutable and hard to access by design. And that stinks. And it's such a flaw with so many of our systems of government. And what we are really trying to help do with these toolkits and by making ourselves available to anyone who's interested in pursuing these types of things in their community is to try to break through that fog and really make some progress and get new innovative ideas, on legislative floors, in front of city councilors, in legislative committee hearings, so that folks are talking about it, folks are thinking about it, we're building the momentum, and hopefully by designing policies that'll work in your city or state, getting some of these things passed over the next few years across the country.
yeah, that's exactly right, Kevin. And I know we talked a lot of abstractly how the toolkits work, but we do want to provide just some examples. So for instance, one of the things we talked about is we have a food waste prevention and recycling toolkit. So this is really trying to tackle the problem of food waste. We produce a tremendous amount of food waste in this country each year. 40% of the food that is grown and produced in this country goes uneaten. Most of it is going to a landfill, where not only is it fueling the system, the landfill expansions, the proposals to build new polluting landfills, but also food waste, when it breaks down in a landfill, it produces methane, which is a powerful climate damaging gas. So the solution we've seen really pop up are these food waste prevention and recycling laws. They're designed to essentially phase out the disposal of food waste and incentivize and in some ways mandate that excess edible food that's still perfectly good, is being given to those who need it. And the rest of the food waste isn't going to a landfill, it's not going to an incinerator, but it's being sent to a compost facility where it can be put to good use. So with this type of policy, one of the big decisions you have to make is really right at the outset in the definitions part, which is, who do you want your law to regulate? This is a huge question. And we break it down into 3 options. So these images show what the toolkit looks like on our website. So it shows all 10 sections. And this is section 1, where you really need to make this big policy decision that shapes in a lot of ways your whole proposal. And there are 3 options, because this is, something we've seen. 10 states have passed this law, and all of them have kind of taken a different approach. So what this looks like, and I know our communications person is probably very upset with how busy the slide is, so I apologize, but this is trying to show you what it looks like. So the 3 approaches, one is to have a phased-in approach that applies to everyone. This is option 1. This is to slowly ban all the disposal of food waste in your community, to cover initially really large generators of food waste. Think universities, grocery stores, large restaurants, and then over time really narrow that down until you're applying to the household level. And with that education component, Vermont has done this. They have passed this approach in Vermont. Now everyone has to compost their food waste. They're not allowed to send it to a landfill. This is widely considered one of the most successful and effective approaches. And if this is something you think you want in your community, you think you can replicate, then we have the sample language that you can copy and put into that definition section in your bill template, and you can move on to the next section. Maybe you're thinking that's great that Vermont did that. That's definitely not something that's available to my community. I need something that is going to mostly focus on the really large generators, but I still want that flexibility. Option 2 provides that. This type of system really focuses on initially covering those large generators, making sure that the hospitals, the prisons, the universities, places where they're generating 1 to 2 tons of food waste per week are captured under the law. But it also gives your state environmental agency the ability to expand the program over time. Massachusetts took this approach. It's been very successful. They started big and have gone small. Again, we have the sample language. If this is what you want, you copy it, you put it into your bill. Maybe you're thinking, I really just want to focus on those large generators. They're the ones producing a tremendous amount of food waste. That's something that's realistic that I can get past in my community. That's option 3. You cover those large generators. In this system, you also make sure that the only ones covered are those near recycling facilities. So these are the ones that have an option available to them that they're not currently utilizing. And this is the most common approach. Maryland, New York, New Jersey, they've all taken this approach. And it's been very successful. These programs do stagnate a little bit after time because there's not an emphasis on growing them, but they're still tremendously effective. So if this is the option you think works for you, we have that sample language. So this is one example of how the toolkits work in action, where you are empowered to make a decision to customize the policy that works for you. But that's just one example.
And Peter, I just want to add on the point, because you mentioned kind of, the copying and pasting of the sample language, choosing what you want to do and using the sample language. One of the keys that is reiterated throughout our toolkits is that these sample languages are a starting place. They're samples, right? Like, this may be the approach you want, and you look at our sample language and you think, okay, but I think I should fine tune this because I want Vermont's approach, but my state's not Vermont. There are a few things that need to be different here. Like, that is the point of providing more information, of providing the examples and using the language as samples. Play with it as you need to, again, based on the political realities and the needs of your state.
Yeah, that is an excellent point, Kevin. It really is a starting place, and we know finding the starting place can be hard, and that's why we provided this language. And we do hope for some folks it works, but if it doesn't, customize it. Edit it, reach out to us, and we'll help talk through some additional tweaks you can make. We know that there is no one size fits all. That's why we've created these toolkits, and we're hoping that these can be empowering, that we see new approaches that folks are taking that solve some of these big problems. But this is just one example with the food waste. I know a lot of people are concerned about plastics, so we've got some toolkits that focus on that.
Yeah, so I'm gonna take it from Peter here and talk a little bit more in detail about our single-use plastic legislative toolkit. And we actually had a question in the Q&A, which I'm gonna kind of jump ahead and hit a question right now, because Lydia asked, which question do you recommend if I have an issue with grocery bags, i.e. Walmart, Kroger plastic bags? This toolkit, the single-use plastics model legislative toolkit. This toolkit is aimed writ large at many of the single-use plastics that are choking our planet. As you see up here on this slide, we're generating in the US about 14.5 million tons of plastic packaging waste each year. Almost none of that plastic packaging waste is actually recycled every year, and virtually none of it is reused. It is all or almost all ending up in landfills or incinerators, or being littered and ending up in our parks, in our waterways, in our oceans, all of that. We know that across the board, the recycling rate for plastics in this country is really only around 5%. And that 5% includes a practice known as downcycling, where plastics aren't recycled into the same product. A plastic bottle isn't turned back into a new plastic bottle. It's turned into a fleece, which is a stop on the inevitable path toward a landfill or an incinerator. That is especially true for plastic packaging. Almost none of this stuff is recycled in any meaningful way. And so, given the perpetual failures of recycling, we know that saying, oh, well, if people just did a better job putting the right things in the recycling bin, maybe we wouldn't have this problem. That is not going to solve the plastics problem. It especially is not going to solve the plastics production problem, because especially for those of you who are fortunate enough to watch our keynote address this morning, the production process is a big part, if not the biggest part, of the problem here. Plastics pollute at every stage of their life cycle, especially when it comes to extracting fossil fuels to make plastic products, especially when it comes to the dangerous and highly polluting practices at places like the Formosa plastic plant was talked about earlier today, that Diane talked about in her presentation. We can't get to where we need to go unless we're reducing plastic pollution at its source by reducing and in many cases eliminating the production of many unnecessary single-use plastics in the first place, especially single-use plastic packaging, and especially when those items can be replaced with reusable and less environmentally damaging alternatives. So this toolkit is really a mix and match style toolkit. It provides a number of different options for folks to focus on the plastic products that they would like to address in their community. So that could include plastic bags, as Lydia mentioned in the Q&A. It could include polystyrene foam, often known as styrofoam, takeout food containers. It could include restrictions on plastic straws or restrictions on plastic balloon releases. The point behind this toolkit is to design something that folks say, okay, this is a part of the plastics production problem that I think that I can address in my community by targeting this particular type of plastic product, or by targeting these particular types of plastic products. By kind of employing this kitchen sink mix and match approach, we're hoping that folks might see this and say, hey, I want to go crazy and I want to include all of these options in my bill. I should not have said go crazy, because there's nothing crazy about trying to restrict as many unnecessary, unneeded, highly polluting single-use plastics in your community as possible. So you can use this toolkit to go for it. And as with our other toolkits, many of these different sections that are mostly broken down into different types of plastic products contain different options for language, different options for sample language that maybe you think you want to take an approach where you outright ban something, or maybe you want to take an approach where you employ certain, where you impose certain restrictions on types of products or make them available on request only. You'll have those types of options in trying to tailor, again, what you think would work best for your community, because what works best for the city of Providence, Rhode Island, where I live, is not necessarily what's going to work best for someone in a much larger city like Houston, Texas, or a much smaller rural community, or for a statewide law in a particular place or state across the country. You can use this toolkit to go for what you think works.
Exactly. It really is a menu of options. And, you know, a lot of the options you have is picking which products you want, but Kevin alluded to this, you know, there are different options you could take even when you picked one of those products. So we are still sticking with the idea with this toolkit that, you know, even if you know you want to address those single-use plastic bags, there are different approaches you can take. And I think we're at 12, maybe 12 to 14 states have passed these types of laws, and all of them are a little different. So there's room for customizing even beyond just picking what type of products you want to ban or target with your law.
And if you could skip ahead, yeah, thanks, Peter, to the next slide. You know, when it comes to kind of that customizing and experimentation, we've seen that pay dividends in the work that communities across the country have already done in restricting or limiting or banning single-use plastics products in their communities. And we also know from experience that the plastics industry is crafty. You could say a lot of unkind things about the plastic industry, but they're not dumb. And they know how to create and exploit loopholes in all of these types of policies. And for example, when it came to plastic bags, it took time and experimentation as communities and states implemented these laws across the country to try to find the best possible approach to limit the types of loopholes so that grocery stores could just be providing thicker plastic bags and passing them off as reusable when they knew that they were only going to be used a single time. There's more work to be done on that front on all of these plastic products. So this customizable, adaptable approach, letting folks play with new approaches in their communities is kind of key again to that forward momentum. And we've got up on this slide a host of the different options, some of which I've mentioned that you can focus on. We've talked a bunch about single-use bags, and I mentioned polystyrene foam takeout containers and other polystyrene foam products. But there are options in this toolkit to ban non-compostable plastic produce stickers. The stickers that are on your bananas and on your oranges and that are infuriating because sometimes they're really hard to take off. And some of us have kids that don't always spot them, and it goes in the compost bin. Some of us ourselves sometimes forget to take them off. There's options to restrict single-use plastic mini toiletries at hotels and resorts in your community or in your state. We've seen lots of progress on those types of laws across the country. And in fact, we've seen hotels and resorts move forward with these types of initiatives even without policies and laws in place. So that's one where we know it can be done. Folks can use this toolkit and run with that type of policy or law for their community. Folks can impose or draft a bill or an ordinance that would ban black plastic takeout containers, which are unrecyclable. We also often see them for sushi and grocery stores and other food products. Not only are they unrecyclable, but they are also just filled with toxic chemicals and are, like many of these other single-use plastic items, the type of low-hanging fruit that communities are really eager to explore options for getting rid of some of this stuff. As I mentioned before, folks can explore a ban on intentional balloon releases. They can make single-use plastic food serviceware by request only. And there are a host of other options, including single-use plastic wet wipes and things like this in this toolkit. So you can use this toolkit to explore different approaches that have been taken across the country, combine different options to go as small and tailored or as big and all-encompassing as you would like to in your community, and again, craft the type of thing that you think you can get done and make some progress on. Especially as we know that single-use plastics continue to be top of mind for very good reason. And a lot of these, again, low-hanging fruit types of products that are truly unnecessary and we have better alternatives for are a great way to kind of kick off a zero waste journey for your particular community.
Yeah, that's exactly right, Kevin. And I know that was a lot of information. Everyone, thank you so much for going through it with us. We do now have some time, so we're really looking forward to chatting with you all about the Q&A. I do want to jump in on one of the questions that was asked about how do you address those single-use plastic bags. Our single-use plastics toolkit is great. I also think there's room for our truth in labeling toolkit to be a really good way to address that problem as well. As Kevin was saying, we're seeing an increasing focus, especially in states that have passed single-use plastic bag bans, on this greenwashing of claiming that these are somehow recyclable when we just know they're not. The Truth in Labeling Toolkit is great because it puts the onus on the companies to actually accurately label and tell the truth about their products, and especially the recyclability or compostability of those. So I think that's another wonderful toolkit that we can use to kind of address the plastic bag question as well. But I see we have a couple good questions. Kevin, I'll get us started. One question that came through is, how can NGOs and community groups be sure to push for consistency so that implementation is easier? And there's a little bit of clarification saying, thinking, about some of the complex bills that we have to make sure that, these complex bills, once you get them passed, are actually going to be implemented in a way that makes sense, in a way that's actually enforceable.
Yeah, I mean, especially if we're talking about kind of consistency within a bill and consistency perhaps with programs that already exist in a state. The details matter on a lot of these big programs. We can be as ambitious as possible, and I think ambition, especially when it comes to trying to achieve zero waste in our communities, is super important. Um, but the bill language, the approach has to be detail oriented and kind of fit with the realities of programs that may already exist in states. And that's kind of one of those places where uh, kind of straying from best practices on that front could potentially cause a problem. Now, the good news is when it comes to our toolkits and when it comes to kind of looking at what other states have done well or not so well, especially when it comes to some of these more layered, complex bills, there are a lot of lessons to be learned and there are a lot of best practices to be learned. And those are the types of things that we've done our best to integrate into these toolkits. But there's no question that especially when it comes to some of these bigger programs, like packaging reduction laws and like deposit return systems or bottle bills, beverage container recycling and reuse laws, they can be tough. And not only have we kind of created these toolkits for folks to use, but also all of us at Just Zero want to make sure that we're kind of offering our help in the process. So if folks are working on a bill, whether they're using our toolkit or not, they may be working on something that they started and it has nothing to do with our toolkit, but they want to have a conversation about how to make it as consistent as possible, how to make it as workable as possible. Those are the types of conversations and that's the type of work that we're always happy to dive in on with folks from across the country. So please reach out as those issues may arise in your community and on your kind of quest to build some of these bills, again, whether using our toolkits or not.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I know there's a lot of emphasis with, zero waste legislation because we are seeing a huge uptick in the amount of laws being passed to address the plastic pollution crisis, to kind of deal with these different things, a lot of which we've used as our examples in the toolkits on kind of harmonizing things to make it easier for implementation and in some ways for producer compliance. And, I think we need to be careful when that's brought up, when people are talking about how to make these things easier. In a lot of ways, the laws we're talking about are targeting very bad actors who do not want these laws to pass. And there is room, especially with some of the bigger programs. I'm thinking about EPR for packaging reduction and recycling laws, for that kind of harmonization on some things. But really, ultimately, our toolkits, I think, reflect the fact that every community is different. Every community has specific needs that are not going to be aligned with other communities and states that have passed these policies. So there is always going to be that difference, whether it means that they're targeting a little bit more of plastics, what's the EPR thing, or they're talking, a little bit more holistically about including paper in their program. There's a lot of room for experimentation, and that experimentation is needed because while the waste crisis is something we're all facing, we're dealing with it and the impacts we face are different.
Yeah, spot on, Peter. I think I'll pivot us to another question if that works for you, Peter.
Yeah.
And this one will be for you. And we've had a few questions come in via the Q&A feature about enforcement. Whether we have any recommendations on the enforcement side of food waste bans, or to extend that even further on any of these types of laws, and whether there are people and resources in local and state government allocated for enforcement. So I was hoping maybe, Peter, you could start by speaking kind of generally to the issue of enforceability, the need for enforcement when it comes to designing these types of laws, and how we've kind of integrated those needs into the toolkits themselves.
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's an important question because when we are talking about passing new laws, we're talking about fundamentally changing some of the ways we do things. And usually that's for very good reasons when it comes to the toolkits we have and the laws we're talking about. But the laws only mean something if they're going to be enforceable. It's great if you have the best bill on paper, but if there's not actually going to be enforcement, it can sometimes feel like you've gone through the legislative process and what do you have to show for it? So every single one of our bills has an enforcement section because we know that is critical. We have looked at all the different policies in our toolkits and tried to figure out the best enforcement measures that can be there. And a lot of times that does mean that when it comes to enforcement, there are options. So I know there was a specific emphasis on Massachusetts waste ban. States, or up to 10, have addressed the issue of enforcement with these food waste prevention and recycling laws in different ways. Some states, Vermont is not going through everyone's trash, even though it applies to everyone at the household level. They have a kind of complaint function to try to figure out where the issues are, where the non-compliance is, and they take an educational approach to try to rectify it before doing any type of hard enforcement measures, thinking of fines. Other states, have not taken that type of complaint approach, but sticking with the education. So we really did try to look at the enforcement options available for the different policies to figure out what the best way to deal with this is. But ultimately, I will say, with a lot of times when we're talking about laws, we need to be part of the enforcement. New York single-use plastic bag ban, I know there were a lot of issues with rolling it out, and folks were telling people, they were reporting it to DEC even when there wasn't a hotline to make sure it was known that they see people not complying with the law and it needs to be addressed because people worked very hard to get that law in place and they want to see those bags taken out of circulation. So we do think about it. It's in all the toolkits, and it's a huge component, right? Like these are the ways that the laws actually have meaning.
And on that, Peter, again, one of the reasons um, for really leaning into this adaptability approach and the ability for folks to use toolkits to experiment, especially when it comes to enforcement, is that depending on the type of law that we're talking about, are we talking about a single-use plastic bag ban, or are we talking about a packaging reduction law that targets larger companies, well-resourced companies, as opposed to smaller, far less resourced, at times small businesses that are selling food and providing it in single-use takeout bags. And what do those businesses look like in your community, and how large is your community? Depending on the size of your community, an educational campaign to make sure that all the small businesses understand what the obligations are could look very different than what the needs would be in a large city or across an entire state. Or again, for a program that maybe targets some of the larger actors. So it's kind of really important to hone that part in, because especially when it comes to plastic bag bans in particular, we've seen the hurdles kind of across the country. Those of us that are paying attention to this kind of run the gamut. You've got bad actors out there, especially some of them that are, running major retail chains who know exactly what they're doing when they're still providing single-use checkout bags after a ban has gone into place. And at the same time, you see other folks, again, generally some of the smaller businesses, who it just comes down to the fact that they don't know that this law went into effect. It turns out that folks running a single food truck as a small business trying to generate profit to feed their family, they don't have a compliance department that's telling them when a new plastic bag ban has gone into effect. So the relative need and efficacy for education versus kind of like hard hitting enforcement varies based on the need, based on the community. And again, our toolkits allow folks to dial that in, especially in working with lawmakers and regulatory agencies to kind of like hone in the approach that'll work best for your community.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I see a related question to the enforcement coming in about if we can't get, some of the composting and plastic bag bills enforced, how are we going to enforce these larger laws? And I'm thinking about our toolkits, when I think about the bigger programs we have, the EPR for packaging, the bottle bills, again, we've created language that we really do think addresses that problem. I know for EPR for packaging, in our model toolkit, what we've done is take what we see as a best practice and we make sure that there is funding made available from the companies paying into this program to fund the state environmental agency, who we know the state environmental agencies in lots of ways are strapped and they're overworked and they're dealing with these unfunded mandates. We're making sure this isn't one of them. We've seen states do this in the 5 programs that have passed, and we made sure in the enforcement section of our bill that there's this money made available to make sure that the state has the resources to implement the law, because that is a huge part of it. And just, I can't help but think when we're talking about enforcement, how wonderful Diane's story was this afternoon with the keynote about she saw the impacts of when, permitting rules and the Clean Water Act was not enforced. And a lot of times it does come down to tenacity and her fighting to get that enforcement done, and she ultimately won. So, we have the good language in our toolkits, but hopefully the people who help get these bills passed are staying vigilant and making sure that the law is working. I know we try to do that with a lot of the work Just Zero does. So Kevin, I think we've got time for one more question, and I'll ask it of you. So I am just curious, you have done a lot of legislative work. When you think about building these customizable bills, if you're someone who has not had a lot of experience working through the legislative process, what would your advice be, other than using our toolkits, for getting involved in this type of work and making that difference in your community?
Yeah, I think that great question, Peter. I think the single, I don't know if biggest is the right word, but it is biggest in some ways. The biggest piece of advice is strength in numbers, right? Like the best place to start when it comes to really any type of policy-based initiative that you want to get accomplished in your community, any type of environmental law, any type of law that's designed to protect members of your community in any way, is to build a group of people around you. Because chances are, if there's an issue, whether it's related to waste or anything else that you are worried about, you have friends and neighbors and family members and other members in your community who are worried about the same exact thing. So start with whether you call it a coalition or a group or just a collection of people who are trying to get stuff done to protect their community. Start by building that smaller community, that community of people who are engaged in this work and want to get it done. Because especially when it comes to these types of policies, they're the types of things that aren't necessarily intended to be a solo show, right? There's a lot of work that needs to be done to get any of this implemented. And at the end of the day, when we're talking about passing ordinances, passing legislation, key to doing that is your city council members, your town council members, your state legislators, senators and representatives feeling that this is something that their constituents want. And so kind of building that groundswell of support from the get-go. And just like we've designed these toolkits for folks to kind of build the policy from the ground up, have as many people as possible working with you to kind of build the momentum and build the push for these types of laws and policies from the ground up.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. It feels a little cliche to say strength in numbers, but it really is so important. And, we talked about it when we were explaining the legislative process and going through the toolkits. And it is complicated. It is hard to do this. And when you have numbers on your side and when you have facts, which we do, because we know the truth about the current system that we're dealing with and how polluting and toxic it is, you can make a difference. And I'm not saying this stuff is going to happen fast always, but it will happen. And we are seeing a tremendous amount of progress. And I am looking at my clock and I do see that we are at time. So I just want to thank everyone so much for participating in this and taking time out of your night, out of your day to join us for our Waste Free Future Summit. The fun continues tomorrow. We have 2 sessions tomorrow communicating about zero waste, where we have an expert panel talking about how we break down the complicated things that we're trying to address. into ways that are understandable and actionable. Really excited for that one. And then we resume again tomorrow night, 7:30 p.m. Eastern, to talk about zero waste campaigns in action, where we have a great panel of activists from across the country focusing and sharing stories about the work they're doing, the obstacles they face, and how they've overcome it to have change in their community. And then we wrap up on Friday with the future of zero waste advocacy. So thank you so much again for being a part of this. We really do appreciate it. The recording will be shared and made available. Please feel free to share it far and wide. And I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your night. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.